blind spot in economics that I'm going to talk about is socioeconomic structure. And I already promised Perry yesterday that even though it sounds long and boring, that I will try not to bore you to death with it. So I think the best way to illustrate what I mean by that, in lack of a better word, is by way of an example. And since we are here at the North America convening and we're in the US, I thought I'd choose an example that was special to the region. So I'm going to talk about pizza. But that's just one example, of course. So let's assume now that we have this question. We want to approach it in a scientific way. Why do people in Chicago buy more deep pan pizza, where people in New York buy more thin crust pizza, right? Like, that's a typical question that you could ask an economist. And I think that the typical question or the typical answer that a textbook economist will give you if you pose him this question is because the people of Chicago demand more deep pan pizza and the people of New York demand more thin crust pizza. Or basically because the people of Chicago like deep pan pizza more. And what I'm going to try to argue now is that I don't find that a very good explanation. I almost find it as no explanation at all. Why do I think this is such a problematic explanation is like, try to imagine that 50 years from now we ask the same question to the future generations of who lives in Chicago and the future generations of who lives in in New York, and then we try to consider whether we would expect there to still be more deep pan pizza in Chicago and more thin crust in New York, or whether this would have flipped around. I know what I think. What would you guys think? Would you think that it's the same, that people still prefer deep pan in Chicago? Raise your hand. Yeah. Okay, there's quite a few, not everyone, but I definitely think that in 50 years we will not see this element have switched around, but that kind of invalidates the idea that it's because the people of Chicago somehow prefers it, because in 50 years there won't even be the same people, and yet we see that there's a historical relationship between Chicago and deep pan pizza that we expect to kind of like travel on into the new agents that are being born. I would actually even claim that it's probably a better explanation to say that the reason someone likes deep pan pizza is because they're from Chicago, rather than to say that, okay, the reason that everybody buys deep pan pizza in Chicago is because they like it. But that actually brings us to the blind spot of economic theory, because that's not the way that economic operates. Economic always wants to reduce any economic phenomena that we observe by reducing it to the individual intentions of agents. And this is just one example. Like, this pizza example is an example of what I will call a socioeconomic structure, right? Like, so there's a way in which when we act in the economy, we're actually inheriting a lot of stuff. We didn't choose to be born in Chicago, and yet it shows us which kind of actions that we have there. And there are many, many structures that you can say that we are host to, that we are kind of carrying. There's economic structures, but there's also social structures, historical structures. And these structures are not stuff, like there's economic phenomena, but they're not necessarily the choices of preferences or choices by individual agents. They're just something we inherit. Basically, you can say that we inherit it in the same way, and I think this is a really good metaphor, or like similar, in the same way that we operate with a language. We have all kinds of stuff that we want to express, and we, as individual language users, we have free will to explain all kinds of stuff, but it doesn't explain English, right? English is something we inherited. If you want to understand what English is, you don't go out and ask all language speakers, what do you want to say? Because they just inherited English from their parents. And I think there's all kinds of elements in the economy, and in order to understand the economy, we need to understand the historical structures, all these things that we inherit in, and within which we are making the choices. And this is the same for all these. There's all kinds of elements in the economy who are basically the consequence of how the economy was set up before any of us was part of it. We kind of inherited in economic structures. So that's kind of explaining what I mean by that. And why is this a blind spot? It's a blind spot because economic theory always tries, at least in many versions, I say mainstream micro is probably the best, but there's a lot of ways in which economists all over has this idea that in order to explain an economic phenomena, you need to reduce it to the individual intentions of actions and then aggregate them up, and then you get to the economy. This is just mainstream micro as an example. A general equilibrium model, you start out by having utility function, preferences of individuals, production function, which is the technology and what's available. You maybe have endowments. That will kind of like you will meet in an equilibrium, creating a price vector, and that leads to the economic outcomes. But there's a very clear one-way causality here, where you start with the individual preferences and you end up with the economic outcomes. And it's not just in micro. I think in macro, it's very common to demand micro foundations. So you have this idea that you can find a statistical relationship between stuff, but that doesn't mean that you truly understand the phenomena. If you want to truly understand the phenomena, you have to somehow reduce it to preferences of individual agents and technology. So only if you can reduce it into that kind of individual preference have you truly explained the phenomena. But I think if that's the way you kind of explain, if you think the economy is only the aggregation of all the individual actions, then you're going to miss, or you won't have a blind spot for this way that structures are working the other way around. Why don't we ever talk about the macro foundation of micro? Why don't we try to explain the individual action? Why did I prefer a deep pan pizza by the economic structures that were given to me? Yeah. I'm going to leave you, I don't know if I'm close to 8 minutes, but I want to talk about this quote, because I think if we want to understand why economics is set up in this way, we have to go all the way back to the birth of economics. There's a lot of people in the audience now that do history of economic thought. I think it's closely connected to how economics arose and how that was connected to a specific view of the subject in 18th century England, where we originally saw political economy come from. There's a range of philosophers in that period, David Hume, Thomas Hobbes, Adam Smith, that start working from a new way of conceptualizing what is a subject, what is a man, what is a woman. That's for you. And this view of man, it allows us to ask new kinds of questions. So these people are talking about contract theory. How do we have the state if it's all built on individual it's about utilitarianism, but it also opens up political economy as a way for these subjects to interact. What is these subjects? Well, I think this quote by Hume illustrates it perfectly. Ask a man why he uses exercise. He will answer, because he desires to keep his health. If you then inquire why he desires health, he will readily reply, because sickness is painful. If you push your inquiries further and desire a reason why he hates pain, it is impossible to give any. This is an ultimate end, and it's never referred to any other object. So this idea that the ultimate explanation is the intentional states of agents is really clear here. And economics arises as this way of saying, like, since we have all these agents with different interests, how do they come together and equilibrate that? But it's also the view that we still have in much microeconomic thinking. This is the reason that we don't want to transfer utility from one to another. This is why we always start with the utility function and ends up somewhere else. It's also the idea of man or woman as a utility function, right? And it allows us to ask certain questions, but it hides socioeconomic structures. So since we're here and we're talking about how do we go forward? Is there new things that we would do with economics? What is the next paradigm? I would encourage that we start by giving up on this idea, and we maybe should study the economy more like it was a language than it was a collection of individual interests. Because you could take this quote that Hume has and replace ask a man why he uses exercise and just replace it with why does a man want to eat a deep pan pizza? And now I apologize for having talked so much about food, because we still have to listen to Perry and the dinner is not in another hour, but I hope you'll hold it. Thank you.